Hello, I'm your host Peter Sawchuk, a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. You're listening to Work, Learning, and Social Change, Foundational Voices, an informal discussion with some of the figures who have helped define the field. In this episode, I'm speaking with Henning Salling Olesen, professor in the Department of People and Technology Learning, Education and Pedagogy at Roskilde University in Denmark. With work spanning almost 4 decades, he is known as one of the most defining voices of the psychosocietal approach to work and learning. Welcome and hello, everybody out there. As you probably have gleaned, our discussion series is meant to be really informal. This discussion series focuses on work, learning, and social change, as you know. But let me begin with a few just basic prepared remarks about our guest today. In a lengthy and extraordinary career, Henning Salling Olesen has remained fascinated by questions of learning, identity, socialized experience, and consciousness in work life. Constant throughout has been a profound concern to understand and support working people and the labor movement. He's the author, co-author, or editor of 16 books, including a recent collection entitled The Societal Unconscious, Psychosocial Perspectives on Adult Learning from Brill. I first discovered him, however, in the early 1990s with a book entitled Adult Education and Everyday Life, and it's something I return to fairly regularly, actually, because the questions he's interested in are ones I'm interested in as well. He's served as the chair of the European Society for Research and Education of Adults. He's been active in the Sino-Danish Center promoting international teaching and education partnerships on the theme of work and learning. In 2014, he was awarded an honorary doctor from the University of Tampere, Finland. Henning, welcome. It's great to see you, and thanks for taking time in these different time zones to contribute to our discussion series. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you agreeing. And it's not always easy to organize these things. And because I know you continue to be very busy. Anyways, let me just begin with my first question. And it's a pretty simple one in a way. And I'm simply asking you, I don't want to report my impressions of your work. I want to ask you your own impressions of your own work. And I want you to describe, if you can think of it as one approach in a way, to describe your approach to work, learning, and social change research. What are its strengths? What are its core concerns, its core problematics maybe? And how do you feel it's maybe distinct from other kind of ways of approaching similar questions? What would you say about that?
Maybe I can try to illustrate a little the development of the approach, because on the one hand, I see it as one approach, but on the other hand, it has developed over those 40 years or so in a significant way, and it started out really kind of with the book you showed just before, with an engagement in adult education, especially in collaboration with the labor movement, and you could say that the point was in relation to pedagogy as a field, education as a field, that we wanted to emphasize the fact that learning is not a school phenomenon, but is a life phenomenon, and that in order to understand people's learning process, you need to understand them as a dimension of lived life. And this comes very clearly out when, for example, you look at labor movement and industrial disputes, that very intense learning processes are taking place that could not be staged in a school setting, but are aspects of real lived life. And so we started to develop this idea more systematically, that learning must be seen as experience, as life experience, and must be conceptualized in the context of people's whole life and background, individually and collectively. And in order to make this handy. Moving out of the classroom, which is a handy circumstance for pedagogical research, but in order to move away from this classroom seen from the learners, from the teacher's position, we thought that to look at life stories was a way of representing a context that everyone could understand, and which also had a high level of legitimacy. And we introduced this into a number of also applied research in collaboration with labor movement, but also with state agencies, labor market agencies, that if you want to understand what happens in the learning process, you need to be interested in this whole life process. And in terms of method, we picked up something which was quite trendy and widely spread, especially maybe in the women's movement and feminist research, namely biographical methods. And so we started out doing individual biographical interviews and analyzing how they played a role for learner motivation, for learner participation, for the way people met any learning offer, and we managed to get it accepted as part of some major empirical projects, where you could say the usual form of social and applied social research was rather instrumental. Can you make some statistics on the effects of some kind of intervention or some kind of offer, but we managed to make a kind of mixed method, combining these usual methods with a more qualitative, subjective method. And yeah, this is has developed then in a lot of empirical projects, which were rather different depending on circumstances and people and so on, but trying to then at the same time keep up a kind of methodological ambition of creating an alternative to, say, pedagogical theorizing of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is I mean, this is the beginning, and from which we have developed, and then maybe some further steps can be elaborated. But we also, I would emphasize that it was also a very problem-oriented methodology, that we were mostly engaged in change processes, in political interventions, and there was mostly also some kind of agency connected with it, creating recommendations for policies, or helping people to make their own way and make their own requirements for learning. So this agency aspect was always very present also.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Can I ask you, well, something you mentioned right early in the going there, this question of taking seriously kind of learning in everyday life has been a kind of a project for many different traditions in the last, not to make it too simplified in a way, but last 30 or 40 years. But they do it in very different ways. And then connecting that with, and it's always a challenge to kind of break a bit of I will say a hegemony of a kind of organized, pedagogically led, like people learn and lead their own lives in a way. But you do something unique, I would say, and you can correct me on this, which is to say you use biography in the context of a thoroughly social, I'll use the word socialized, experience. What appears and feels like in the learning process is a individual. I have them, you have them, but a thoroughly socialized. So there's a methodological component to get into it, but what's necessary to make use of that, I'm asking you, is this kind of very specific, a very, very precise theoretical resources that can make that jump in its unique way that you do. And are you still using the psychosocietal terminology as the approach, roughly speaking?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say this is so far the end point of developing this. We picked up a lot of inspiration from especially German critical research, the Frankfurt School of social theory, and combine that or use that as a framework for empirical studies. And so it was also in the political commitment, you could say, that although working with individual life histories and individual biographies, it was never an individual method. We had always the understanding theoretically and also very practically that people are not learning and not acting as isolated individuals. And so in order to elaborate then in a way, what does that mean? We have also from the Frankfurt School tradition picked up as a theorizing of socialization, which you could in a simple way say that this is a theory about how the individual is becoming as he or she is out of the social circumstances in which his or her specific individual life history is shaped. So it's to say that in each individual mind and emotional development, there is traces of societal experience and basic structures of social environment. Not to say that it is a determining circumstances. This is of course very important, but to say that people develop their lives, their subjectivity in the context in which they live. And we picked a theoretical inspiration, which has been topical and is also introduced, among others, in the book you mentioned, the Societal Unconscious. I would like to say a little more about that in a while, but from a psychotherapist originally called Alfred Lorenzer, who kind of took the challenge from psychiatric knowledge that heavy psychiatric problems have to do with disturbance of the individual's relation to others, to reality, to the social environment. And so he developed a method to interpret mainly, say, cultural phenomena as results of societal influence in the individual socialization. And we took that, so to say, away from that context and said, well, let us think about life experience as a socialization story, and let us listen to the story that the individual tells, or observe the interaction between specific individuals and try to interpret how they are shaped by, influenced by societal conditions. And what is then very important in the Frankfurt School context, also try to trace their more or less hidden imagination about developing. So as to say that in the individual being shaped by, influenced by societal environment is also all the social contradictions and limitations that we are all experiencing, including also those that we theorize in social theory, like class and paid labor and so on, authority relations, which are all basic framework conditions, and we make our individual psychic representation of that, and within that we also develop imaginations about what could be changed, a certain kind of individual historical consciousness, that how did it come, which can in best cases be elaborated. There's one author that we have been particularly inspired by, besides Alfred Lorenz and, well, the big philosopher Theodor Adorno, but there's a German social researcher and philosopher, Oskar Negt, who actually took departure in the labor movement and tried to work with this the concept of experience and the idea that out of everyday life experience most often comes acceptance and routine everyday life. What is possible is possible, but also some traces of dissatisfaction of ideas about things that could be different. You could say you could call it utopian traces packed in everyday life, and so in the context of labor movement, he developed that as a kind of idea for labor education.
Well, can I say, certainly something you mentioned earlier, the idea of, in a way, the social imagination, both individual and thoroughly socialized, as the site in which all forms of utopian or dystopian, I would say utopian or dystopian, the whole can, it could be pursued almost as a middle range concept, but yeah, okay. And then this question of disturbance, distortion, essentially relationship between societal and individual as played out through life, imagination, consciousness, unconsciousness. Is it true that the response in one way or another to disturbance, the term you used, in this area, that is the kind of is it true? My mind's thinking this is the kind of heart of the learning dynamic, the evolution or whatever, or devolution of an individual's relationship with society, is in that point of negotiating, resolving, partially resolving, repressing that disturbance. Is that part of the learning dynamic? Because I read a lot of sociologists who provide great kind of I take this term from you and some of the traditions you use, scenic understanding of some of these dynamics. But the beating heart of a everyday learning dynamic, is it in more of these kind of things I've just kind of started to mention there, or am I misreading that?
No, I think that I think it's the very core of something that is distinct in this psychosocietal approach is to adopt an assumption, a concept from psychoanalytic thinking, namely the concept of the unconscious. And very simply spoken, then in the first place, assuming that part of the socialization, the building of the individual subject, is a distribution or a combination of becoming social by becoming able to share your experience in the language which is the medium of social interaction. So this is the medium of belonging socially, and this is what quite often is the only part of a socializing concept. Very often you think of it as just the individual becoming social, learning to interact. What is in the psychoanalytic heritage is then to say this development is not without contradictions. There are pains and frustrations in early childhood, but also throughout life, which mean that some aspects of experience are relegated to the unconscious. Doesn't mean that they disappear. They are still active in the psyche. They can sometimes come out as ununderstandable agencies or emotions, but most often they are repressed and kept under a lid. But this is a very simple version, and then you could say that the real fact is that there is an ongoing dynamic in the area between the zone between conscious and unconscious emotional aspects, and this means that all the time you are so to say processing. When you learn something, you're getting socialized in a new way in this specific respect. It can be fairly external if you learn something, some facts by heart, but it can also be very important for the identity and the person. And at the same time, you are all the time also processing some aspects of emotional stuff, which has conflicts, pains, defensive aspects, and you could say then that this is the emotional core of learning processes. And the point is, of course, I would say that you cannot separate emotional and cognitive dimensions of the learning process from each other. We learn a lot which has little emotion, but most often it has some. But really important organizing of our everyday life, our practices, and also our what we would call worldview, our view of reality, of ourselves and our opportunities, our possible ways of development. They are in the field of both cognitive and emotional charge.
Well, can I say this is one when I teach your work, and the kind of you have to teach a little bit other people's work around that in order to make best use. But students get very excited about this type of unification you're talking about between the cognitive. We slowly build up in a course of advanced theory, learning theory, adult learning theory around the questions of build it up basically. But what is cognition? What is emotion? But this unification and what anchors it in the, I'll say, the emotional lives of the learners in my courses is this question of defense. based, they immediately, intimately, unproblematically say, oh, okay, this is a concept that, so when we get to the 2 weeks where we cover this stuff, they latch onto that as their entry point in a way to the other content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, defense is also a multiple concept. On the one hand, you could say that we have conscious defense. We try to avoid things that are undesired or painful or something. But what is at stake when we talk in psychodynamic terms, then it's also unconscious mechanisms which helps us avoid difficulties, painful recognition, changing our nice routine, everyday life by keeping some aspects unrecognized. And you can make a systematic description of different ways of defending, which are, so to say, the result of the unconscious processes. It can, for example, be to delimit the horizon of attention in the form of, oh yes, but that has nothing to do with by compartmentalizing your reality and your cognitive recognition of it. You can keep things apart which do relate, but it makes it complicated to relate. But the most obvious kind of defense, I guess, maybe what makes your students immediately recognize is what we see as resistance to accept things that are inconvenient or cannot be transformed into agency immediately, including learning resistance, which is in lots of cases. But we also know it from simple interaction. I mean, most quarrel with people, especially loved ones, maybe are about something that is, on the one hand, offering a recognition, a cognitive insight, but also feels like an offensive, an offense on one's routines or practices or self-understanding, and we meet it with defensive reactions, and so I mean, this is a huge part of everyday life.
Before we go on, I have another. You've half answered a question I have in my back pocket here next, but before, I just have a follow-up on one of the things you've started me thinking about it. Like we talk a lot about in a way, or you've talked a lot about, and I understand that it's a broad perspective that thinks of the life of a person, a personhood in a broad way. What is the difference though when we tie into not just lifelong learning from a psychosocietal approach, but into what is the difference that it makes when we want to connect it to work lifelong learning, say? How does the psychosocietal approach, what kind of specific things in relationship to the context of work and maybe occupation, slightly different term, and idea. What is the difference that the psychosocietal approach makes when it brings on board this question of work learning? And what we say in our title of our discussion, work learning and social change, but work, what's the difference when the psychosocietal approach meets work? What is the difference that makes?
Well, I think maybe two aspects. One is the very simple observation that when we see the interaction between a person or a group and a work process and a work task, and for example, a novelty like a new technology or new tasks, then the simplistic learning theory is to assume that here is a set of new challenges and people learn, or maybe they do not. They learn to navigate that. So the learning is an effect of the work reality, the work processes, technologies, for example, work organization. And the first important point is to say that no, it's not. It's a meeting between two dynamics. One, which is the development of work and the artifacts and organization, and on the other hand, lifelong experience of workers, which may or may not have important implications for the way of learning in such a situation. Because when we learn, if we look at it the way I just sketched, then we are rearranging experiences which are rooted in the past, rooted in certain contexts, and we try to apply them in a new context. You used the word scenic a few minutes ago, and this is one of the key words in Alfred Lorenz's interpretation technique, namely the assumption that experiences and knowledge is always acquired in a holistic context, which includes the environment, the relations, the emotions involved in it. This means that our life experience is in principle organized like scenes from the past. Must not be taken too simplistic, but when we then enter in a new situation, we recognize certain items and certain relations and so on. And if we are very defensive, then we do not recognize. Then we say, I don't know anything about this, but you know, the joke about the students answering the examination questions by, I don't know anything about that, but Napoleon said, indicating that he's stuck in a certain knowledge, and fortunately this is not the case in general. On the contrary, people very dynamically reinterpret and mobilize knowledge and possibilities from the scenic baggage that they carry with them. And so in this sense, yeah, so in this sense you would say that this is an important way of seeing learning in a work context, that the worker or the workers are bringing their own background for meeting the environment.
Well, I was going to say the maybe not utter wholeness of a world, of a context, we'll say work world. There is an unspoken wholeness, or at least near wholeness of a scene that is unproblematically taken up by some, and then as you said, in the defensive. And it's fascinating. I mean, I remember reading back on well, this is a kind of a Freudian thing, but the idea of the immediate wholeness of dreams. You can have a dream for a second, but you knew exactly what the dream was about, even though because that wholeness comes out. distorted, or however it is, but some projection of a wholeness. Let me ask you, before you, because you've given a really good background of key kind of resources that have kind of come together to inform the psychosocial approach as you practice it. Before there was a clear sense of this direction, which has been in place for you, I feel like a long time. You have to correct me on this one way or another. But before that, what were the things, before this was a clear vision of a methodological, analytic and methodological approach, a psychosocietal approach, what were the things that you were working on that somehow, in hindsight, turned out to be stepping stones towards that?
Yeah, I think in one way you could say that there was a tension because I'm politically coming out of student movement, but also working class socialization, and for that reason I was early well read in Marx and Marxism, but also in a way of Marxism as a holistic understanding of the determinedness of a capitalist social environment. And then on the other hand, you could say that working in pedagogy, but also working as a student activist and so on, you are socialized in a what I would call an idealistic optimism, assuming that it's possible to change the world, it's possible to organize learning processes and outcomes in a specific way. And this tension between, say, the assumption that human action and humans are conditioned and limited by a capitalist society, a capitalist environment, and the need to act and the optimistic belief in the possibility of agency was kind of, you could say, this is a dilemma that it's a tension that must be resolved. So in professional sense, you could say that the response to this is to say that, well, pedagogy has much to tell us about ideas of education. It has much to tell us also in some versions about how to teach, how to stage educational situations, but it also has severe limitations because it works best in a school. Once you have put people in a specific position and you have a developed idea about what they should learn, what they should find out, then pedagogy is in its place. And so that's, you could say, that's shaping the idea that we need to develop an alternative framework of thinking in relation to, say, classical pedagogy.
So there were some practical as well as kind of theoretical aspects. I know what you mean. The practical experience of pedagogy, of teaching, I remember facing those myself, and it raised so many questions, that you're, well, essentially they don't give you resources to cope with. And yet also, you just to return to this question of, there's a reference there to a kind of, I guess, one or another form of a kind of Marxist, I'll say, I assume a more Marxist social science, rather than just an organizing political. But anyways, you can correct me on that. But that there were questions that seemed to pose for you too. Can you just say a little bit more of that, and then I have another question for you before we wrap up here.
Well, the tension I mentioned had the very practical form of trying to engage with trade unions and labor movement to on the one hand to shape labor education, and on the other hand to deal with what you could say was class experience at large, the historical, theoretical tradition of labor movement, but also the everyday life, working life, and to say that you need to find out how could you establish or promote that people learn from their everyday life. Because if you don't do that, then you end up in an elitist position, which is also well known, where somebody else will organize the liberation for the workers. So to assume that, well, the famous dictum that the emancipation of the workers is the workers' own responsibility, you need theoretically to think about learning in a way which understands how learning comes about out of everyday life experiences.
Yeah, and the notion shrunk down of social being over consciousness in the more classic formulation doesn't quite get you there in itself. Is that roughly correct? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I had my cough button on and off, and I forgot which one it was on there. Okay. I want to ask you a question then about things that you've. It's a challenging question. If someone posed it to me, I don't know. I'd have to think about it a long time before I would respond meaningfully. But have there ever been things, methods, research design approaches, theoretical resources, or anything really that you've often had linger in the back of your mind that might be suitable to use someday for something in, we'll say, the psychosocietal tradition to contribute to that, but which hasn't been used to date by you? But it's almost like perhaps an ever receding, something you'll do in the future list or something, but something that hasn't been plugged into that tradition yet as you practice it. But it's something you've always had in the back of your mind, something that might be useful in some ways, impossible, were the work to be done to do so. Anything like that fit that description for you?
Yeah. Well, I think it is in this idea about psychosocietal interpretation that it is an unlimited, unended complexity of environmental factors or circumstances which are relevant. So you can, from the very beginning, you can say that it's not possible to make something like a full, well conducted interpretation because you will be short of knowledge, short of insights about circumstances. And then for most of us, not all, but most of us also, you could say that you also need to have a full psychodynamic training to be able to deal with all those dimensions of the psychic that are relevant and involved. But I guess this is not the answer you are seeking, but it is part of an answer for me, because it sets a direction for work, namely to try to be able to include as much of societal analysis and as much of of psychic insight in specific ad hoc specific interpretations. Then I would say that that two dimensions. When we move from the biographical concepts to a life history or psychosocietal interpretation, there is an important step to say that the biography or the told story is just a story. It is a linguistic presentation made by the interview person, which presents a certain way, which has many levels, but also has is traced by also unconscious dynamics of that person. So in principle, we start there a discussion which goes together with the questions which post-structuralism and constructivism are dealing with, namely that well, is there any reality or is there any reality which is not already mediated through language, discourse, or whichever concept you use. So the whole question about how to deal with language and the role of language in our the epistemological issues about language is something that I'm sure I will never catch up with in my lifetime. But you could say that that's one of the reasons for being interested in Adorno, because Adorno was a social philosopher, but also a methodological thinker who exactly had this awareness that reality is already mediated in social language, and for that reason there is no undisturbed access to reality, but critical analysis of reality must go through critical analysis of language and concepts. The other thing I would say is, which I think there's a better chance to deal with, is the material, the material dimension of the social, because you could say that the Frankfurt School sociology is a materialist theory introducing psychodynamic understanding of social interaction, is after all an idea about how we are our bodies are socialized and our bodies are active basis of our feelings and our social interaction. So it is a materialist way of thinking. So to connect those lines of materialist assumption, I think is a possible development, but we do it within a scientific context, which is to be philosophical, you would say that we are living in a Cartesian environment where the concept, the thought is assumed to structure matter or materiality, and so it is a difficult exercise to to justify such a materialist point of view.
Yeah, a materialist dialectic is a challenge.
Yeah,
to have alive ideal and material. I mean, I've always wondered about the abstract representations of the material as a challenge. So it's a different way of phrasing maybe some of your things, but the idea of doing a degree in psychoanalytic therapy. Is that might be not beyond you at this point in your life? I'm not sure. No, but there is such a difference, though, between a therapeutic context and a research analytic context. An interview on the surface, if one were just to take a snapshot of it, it's two people, one person with a notepad in both situations, in a therapeutic as well as an interview situations. They each have a person with a notepad, another person speaking stories. But the wholeness, to get back to that point, is utterly different, I would suggest, and one can't get ethics to do and therapy goes on for years, as it must. But anyways, I appreciate it answers my question, I think, really beautifully. It doesn't, stray from that at all. I think that's fascinating on the layer of material stuff and also the question of language, and in a denser craft of psychoanalytic thinking, which only comes, I would imagine, with clinicians. But okay, let me ask you my final question, which is an open-ended question I want to conclude all my interviews with, is the idea of advice for new researchers that you might have. Now, these could be new researchers, and I especially hope that newly graduated doctoral students from programs interested in work learning and social change can make use of this and make use of words of advice. But there's also a whole raft of researchers who have careers behind them, but are new to the area of work learning in general. Do you have any advice, as my last kind of formal question to you, any advice on this for either new researchers, period, or new researchers to the field of work and learning?
Yeah, well, you had warned me that this question come up, and of course, this is, I think, there's the most noble and important question that you could raise to yourself. If I should say something which was more general than what I do in my supervision of individual PhD students, where I try to help them find a way, it would be something like to keep up the critical point of view, which means, on the one hand, to work empirically, work with real empirical stuff, and on the other hand, to keep critical theory in esteem, and which means, so to say, to dive into reality in the empirical study, but always try to understand it as a historical fluid moment, and also keep up the imagination, as I mentioned, the imagination about possible alternatives, possible developments, how the world could be different, or how it could have been different. But I think this is impossible without having an ambition to be both committed to empirical reality and to the grand theoretical questions, which may be so big that you cannot answer them, but you should keep them active in mind.
That's pretty good advice. I think I see different versions of ways of not doing both of those things. I see people who do all of one and people do all of another, and it's rare that people keep those elements and the important empirical work, as well as a broad vision and broad training in broader theory as well. Anyways, that's very helpful. I appreciate it. I know researchers into the field will enjoy that a bit of advice. I'll take it myself, remind myself again. Anyways, I want to thank you then, just to conclude the interview, I want to thank you very much for taking time, as I said, out of your late afternoon in your case. I think, people have read your work lots. It's different when they see someone just take the time and space to speak to their work, and the face is put with a name on paper, or on a computer screen, as it were today. So it's really helpful, I think, in its own right. I think it changes the if you will, the emotional dynamics of learning a theory and an approach to research. So thank you very much. And I want to say goodbye.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasant challenge to be asked this question, and it was very nice to have the time to explain. So thank you. Thanks for the attention, and goodbye.
Okay, goodbye.